The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hello and welcome to the Daily Racing Form webinar about Timeform US pace figures coming into Formulator. This is a day I have been waiting for, and I'm very happy to announce that it's here. I'm your host, Peter Thomas Fornatale, joined today by two very special guests. First up, he is Timeform US's figure maker. He knows more about this stuff than just about anybody on planet Earth, and we're very excited to hear his perspective on this big change. He is Craig Milkowski. Craig, how are you doing today?
I'm doing great. Glad to be here, Peter.
Excellent, excellent. Also joining in, a huge fan, perhaps the number one fan of the Timeform US product. He's also my co-host on the DRF Players Podcast. Feel free to navigate over to iTunes, SoundCloud, wherever you get your podcasts, and check us out on there if you enjoy our act here. He's the people's champion, Jonathon Kinchen. JK, what's happening?
What's going on, fellas? Yeah, no, I think I've said it 100 times. There's at least a few tournament wins in my life that wouldn't be possible without our friend Craig Milkowski, although he is not as supportive of Kevin Durant as I would prefer he be, but whatever. We'll let him live for that.
We're getting into the silliness already, which I like to see. Are either of you gentlemen watching through the webinar software? Can you confirm that my screen is looking good and you can see it and you can see the Timeform pace figures in there, JK?
Yes, I see it.
Excellent, excellent. Well, let's start off, Craig, by talking to you generally about this move of embedding the Timeform pace figures into DRF Formulator. What can you tell us about how this came about, and how do you see it how do you see it affecting the way that the current Formulator users handicap races?
Well, I think it just gives them another tool. I mean, it just kind of came about when Timeform US was acquired by DRF, which was a good move for me and a good move for us, and I think a good move for DRF as well. And, it just gives them another tool to use when you're handicapping a race. It gives you a good idea what the race shape was. And I tend to look at race shape like an in-race bias, to see who the pace may have favored or not favored in a particular race, and also when the pace was fast, when it was slow, and see who was moving during those times and who might be better than looked and who might not, who may not be as good as they look on the just looking at the running lines.
I know that idea of upgrades and downgrades is something, Jonathon, you talk about all the time, and I know we'll have some examples as we go through these opening day stakes at Santa Anita. But maybe before we drill down to the specifics, I want to get your comments, Jonathon, on how you use these new numbers. And I'll scroll through the race here so folks can see what they look like and see the color coding of blue and red. JK, how do you use these numbers to produce upgrades and downgrades?
I'll tell you what, when it comes to turf racing, I'll start with that. You're like an automatic use for me. If I flip through and you have a bunch of blue in your pace figures as a turf horse, and then I look up to your running line position and you're like 5th, 4th, 7th, 9th, anything like that other than 1st, 2nd, or 3rd, you're like an automatic use, because to me, you were closing into a slow pace, and those are the types of horses that I want, because I think that's a hidden trip. It's not like the standard, stand up in the irons, check 3 lengths trip that everyone sees. I think that's a hidden trip when it comes to slow paces and turf races. So I use it in that regard to upgrade. I also will downgrade a horse in a turf race where they are in that 1st or 2nd position with a bunch of blue. And it's one of the things that I use. And then conversely, when it comes to dirt, I'm more concerned on the dirt with horses being upgraded based on being a part of a red pace, a fast pace, and also horses closing in to red. I would look at more of a downgrade. I know I just gave away my entire Timeform US pace figure opinion in 30 seconds, but those are what I look for in terms of upgrades and downgrades.
That's good. And if folks, there's a lot to unpack here. We understand that, and we are going to back up and explain a little bit about what the red and blue mean. That'll be my next question for you, Craig, if you want to prepare for it. But I do want to point out that you can go back and rewatch this webinar at any time, drf.com/YouTube. A lot of great handicapping content there. Our podcast will be up there, Matt Bernier Show, out of the gate. Lots of great videos by the team back in the studio. But among the content, all of our handicapping sessions and webinars. So if you want to go back and take notes on JK just gave a ton of info, but there's some really good info in there, even if you might have to listen to it 2 or 3 times to digest all of it. So let's go back to basics, Craig. What do these blue and red numbers mean, and how does this pace line work? Or do these numbers that we're seeing in Opportunities PP, for example, we're seeing 2 sets of numbers, one associated with the race, one associated presumably with just Opportunity himself, and are they corresponding to the times that they're under?
Yes, that's exactly what it is. And Opportunity is a good example. Like the times and the calls don't always line up in the past performances. Like the mile and the eighth, we don't give a time for a quarter mile, but we have a pace call. So you notice, to avoid confusion, we didn't put a pace figure under there. We stuck with the figures from the left line up with the figures on the right. So the first figure is a half mile for both, and so on. It's a little bit different in TimeformUS PPs because we show all the calls, but it's good. It just keeps it an easier way to see them. As far as the blue and red go, red we use for hot for a fast pace, and blue we use for cold for a slow pace. And to kind of keep it simple as I can, we base this on how fast the horses ran the race, the final time figure of the race. So, for example, when Gun Runner ran, I don't remember his exact figures, but let's say his pace figure at a half mile was 1:45, and the final time was a 1:40. That's not going to be a red, because even though it sounds like, yeah, it was a really fast pace, for that particular final time figure, it wasn't fast. It was about average. It was what you would expect. Whereas if he had fallen apart and finished and the winner came from the back and ran, say, a 1:20, then that figure would be in red, because we're saying they went too fast for that final time. So, yeah, the one point of confusion people often have is that, they'll say, well, man, these horses went 44 to the half. Why isn't it fast? It's not a raw speed thing. It is more how did it relate to the final time of the race? And what was the shape of the race? Were they finishing? Were they falling apart? Did they go slow and they're flying home? That's what we're trying to show with these pace figures.
And the logic there is pretty clear to me. I mean, it has to do with not only the flow of the race itself, Craig, but also just the racing surface and how that might have contributed, right?
Right, exactly. That's a whole nother story with the variance. Of course, a very fast track, we're not going to code fast fractions just because they're fast. If the surface was really souped up that day, it does use a track variant, just like final time figures. So no difference really there.
Now, the number all the way to the right, we're looking at collected now. So we can look at the figures from the Breeders' Cup Classic and see that number is a 135. Is that your raw speed figure according to your figures, or is that the same as the performance rating that one would see in TimeformUS?
No, that is the final time figure. It's kind of similar to a buyer speed figure. It's a figure we just gave the final time of the race. The figure you're talking about, the overall, where we can combine pace a little bit, that's not shown here in Formulator.
Gotcha. And that's something you can still access through the TimeformUS product. I know for me, I'll still be using both. I like the different ways that the information is presented in both TimeformUS and in Formulator, but I do think this will save me time as a horse player and give me more information when I am just looking at Formulator. JK, how do you see incorporating the two products, Formulator and TimeformUS, that have a lot of the same information but not exactly the same information?
I love it. I mean, I think it's great to be able to, we talked about this on our podcast we did earlier, is that, I was a fan of using the Moss pace figures in here. I just I need something to tell me what I'm looking at, especially at a racetrack that I don't follow every single day. So I don't always know what 46 and 2 means. And so when you look at Collecta's running line, you went 46 and 2, what does that mean? Well, now I can see that if you look back over to the right, that 146 was hot, and that helps me understand that the pace was at least quicker than average, and someone who's closer to it should be considered. for an upgrade. I got a couple. This is just an honest question for Craig. I want to figure out, and I know the answer is probably going to be pretty simple. If you look at the number that the two numbers that collected got in Formulator, it's 146 and 146. If I flip over to my TimeformUS screen, I'm seeing 147, 147. What are the differences between the two? Is the 146 the raw and the 147 is the pace adjusted, or what's the difference?
No, I would assume in TimeformUS you probably have your weight adjustment setting on. I imagine that's what it is, because otherwise it shouldn't be any different. In Formulator, there's no weight adjustments. It's just the actual raw figure. Whereas in TimeformUS, you can turn on the weight. So, if he carried a little less weight that day or a little more, it might be a little bit different.
I turned it off, and that was the difference. Look at that.
Let's
learn something new every day.
Let's talk a little bit about this race specifically, Craig. I don't know if you've had a time to fully handicap all these races, but it's certainly interesting to look at them through the lens of these new to Formulator TimeformUS pace figures. I think they only increase how good collected looks to me in this spot. What did you think?
Yeah, the notes I made for one, we don't show the pace projector in Formulator, but you do still get the early and late ratings. And basically the early ratings are what we use to build the pace projector. And you can see in this race, the collected has a big edge on the field. It looks like he's going to make the lead in this field. I think he's going to be tough. He's not a horse I really am looking to go against. Not really looking to bet on him either. If I was playing the pick 4, pick 5, or I don't know, I haven't looked to see what races were in here, but maybe I'd use Prime Attraction as kind of a long shot with him. I'm not sure if I'd be comfortable singling him, but as far as just the race itself, he definitely looks like he has his field at his mercy.
JK, anything to add before we move on to some of these stakes a little bit later in the card? Your thoughts on this one and anything specific to the TimeformUS figures?
Yeah, no, I think we talked about that today on the show as well. I mean, I think collected is probably the most likely winner for 7 reasons, right? I mean, you got the best jockey in the race, the best trainer in the race, the last race, the best class, the best pace advantage. All these things point in that direction. Unfortunately, those horses still get beat sometimes. I'm going to look at top of the game a little bit underneath. But yeah, I think collected from a pace perspective is definitely one that you could lean on.
What do you like about top of the game?
I just thought the trip last time was a little bit shaky, got shuffled, was on a three race winning streak leading into that. We've talked about how brilliant Kent DeSomro can be at times, and not saying that the ride was totally Kent's fault, but he did get into some trouble, and I do think that affected his ability to finish in the money, and I think that he'll show up and run a much better race here. I would think Accelerate it is going to press collected at least. He can't let him get away. It ruins his chances of winning the race.
So you think if there is a path for him to be beaten, it might be through something like that?
Absolutely.
All right, let's move on to the Mathis Brothers Mile, a chance to look at a turf race through the lens of these pace figures. One of the things that's the most exciting, this will be the first time we ever had pace figures of any kind for turf racing within Formulator. Jonathon, let's keep it with you and your thoughts here.
Yeah, I'm a big fan of Timeform when it comes to turf. I think that one of the things that God bless buyers and what they mean to the sport and to us, but one of the things I think that you miss with a buyer is that you don't have the pace influence in the buyer number. And I think that pace is probably the most important part of turf racing. Ask anybody who bets New York racing on the regular when they go 25 and 49 and 50 to the half. I'm sure Craig loves that when making figures. It's important, I think, to have a final number that you can compare when you have that pace injected influence into the figure. And so I can't look at a turf race without looking at the time form, because I think that's what can help you understand if you're having horses that were closing into slow paces and things like that. So having that at your disposal, I think, is big. And then having the color coding to lead you in the direction of fast, slow, or average is definitely a huge advantage, and one that I think a lot of players can do what they normally do and just let those colors catch your eyes when you're handicapping.
makes a lot of sense. And where does it lead you in this spot?
Well, it suggests that Croy and B Squared are the two horses that should be forwardly placed. That they have the early kind of figures that suggest they should be involved early. But one of the things you'll notice is with Croy, there's some blue early in that last race. Some blue that suggests that he had an advantageous early portion of the race with the 24-1 and the 49 flat. First quarter and first half. And he still found a way to get beat. So for me, that performance should be downgraded based on how it looks. For a lot of people that aren't looking at this, what they want to do is say, oh, well, he drew the rail. He has early speed. He should be forwardly placed. Well, he should also hold on. Well, now he's facing better horses, and he doesn't project to get the same scenario with a Breeders' Cup Sprint horse now showing up here, stretching out, who should show more speed. So I think it makes you, it might lead you to think that he's going to be loose, but I think he'll have a little bit of pressure.
B Squared certainly seems like he could get an advantageous trip. Just taking a quick look at the pace figures. When you look at this race, Craig, what are you seeing?
Well, I can tell you, I do things very similar to Jonathon. And the first horse I saw, and I don't have morning line odds yet, and I'm terrible at trying to guess what they are, but I think the horse is going to be a bit of a price, is Harbor Master. His last running line just is the kind that sucks me right in every time. He overcame a real slow pace. He was wide both ways on both turns. And even though it was a lesser class race, it was just an allowance race, and he's moving into a grade 2. These are only 3-year-olds, so I don't think it's that big of a jump up in class, and I just love the way he finished the race. And he's the kind of horse, if I get a good price on him, I'm going to bet him every single time.
All right, Harbor Master, pretty strong tout for Craig. Any further thoughts from a handicapping perspective on here, JK?
Yeah, I mean, like we talked about on the podcast, Harbor Master was one for me, definitely, just the exact same reasons that Craig said. And then also, Holiday Stone is another one that is a good teaching point when we're talking about those pace figures, showing up with all that blue, and then his running positions just being 6'5", 6th and 5th. He had to pass a lot of horses that were in front of him that were traveling at a comfortable clip. So I think that says a lot about his ability, and just another non-time form handicapping angle is this East Coast contingent heading out west with George Weaver. Yes, his horses run at Del Mar the last 2 times, but getting these East Coast horses on the West Coast running on the turf is something you want to keep an eye out for.
All right, let's move on and have a look at the 7th race, the La Brea. Craig, this one looks like, at first glance anyway, a showdown between 2 pretty famous fillies who've had some serious hype associated with them throughout their 3-year-old year. Unique Bella and Paradise Woods. Do you see it as a clash between those two, or do you have something a little clever here?
I hate to be that guy, but I'm probably going to toss Unique Bella. I'm just not a big fan of her since she's come back from the layoff. I know she had, supposedly ran on the worst part of the track in the Breeders' Cup, and I'm not even arguing that point. But she did give way pretty readily. But I think the biggest issue she has in here is Princess Karen, who's just a really fast horse. She battled with her in the Breeders' Cup filly and mare sprint, and I would assume she's going to do it again, except, she's going to be outside of her again, putting that pressure on and going 7 furlongs. I'm going to be looking for a couple to come from behind here. Even though, as you guys use TimeformUS, we show this race as one that favors on or near the early lead. Even as a guy who made the pace projector, I don't always buy it. I use it as a starting point. And I'm going to be looking for horses to come from off the pace. And I think one of those is Paradise Woods, who has shown she can sprint earlier in her career. She broke her maiden coming from off the pace at 5.5 against obviously weaker competition. But another one that I'm really looking forward to taking a shot with it, what I assume will be a good price, is Mopatism, who just has much the best TimeformUS late pace rating in this field. And given how I think the race is going to set up, I think she's going to have a good shot to run 1-2 in here.
You can see that late pace rating. I'm highlighting it with the cursor on the screen under the jockey's name. Definitely a great tool for trying to find live horses when you think that the pace is going to set up to be hot. One thing I'll say, Craig, is I feel like I have noticed that when it's only two horses with speed, in this case, looking at Unique Bella and Princess Cara, not that there aren't other horses with speed, but when there project to be two who are going to be clear of the rest of them, the jockeys seem to have a way to not cut each other's throat as much as when there's a third horse in the mix. I know you've done a lot of database work and study. Have you ever looked at that issue relative to the pace projector, specifically that idea of not so much the pace figures that are going to be thrown down, but how many horses are projected to be within a length?
Yeah, and that actually goes into whether we code it as blue or red, and that's why this one's coded as blue. I just have a feeling, also, I think Miss Sunset's going to go, even though she's shown a little bit behind. I mean, she's a horse that's sprinted almost all of her career, and she's always on the lead, or I think she's made the lead in every single race until her last couple, where she was just off of it or made it by the half. So, even though she's shown a little bit behind those top two, I think she's going to, especially from the rail, I think she's going to go. So, I only mentioned the two, but it's part of why I don't like it. Like Unique Bella here, I think she's really going to face a lot of challenges.
So when you're doing that self-edit of the pace projector, now we mentioned before, the pace projector is only in TimeformUS, the product, but one could make a pretty good recreation of it simply by looking at these early numbers here also listed right below where the jockey is. So if you can see where I'm highlighting on the screen, the early pace rating for Miss Sunset being a 113 and the late a 66. But when you're going through and editing, Craig, what are some of the other factors that you're using for those opportunities where you're going to say, okay, the pace projector says X, but I think Y?
Just a lot of times, it's trying to look at the last 5 races and rate it. And I look for horses that maybe have shown a lot more speed recently. Whereas, I think, this horse maybe has gotten better, or like Accelerate, who's running earlier on the card that we mentioned, was a good example where he put blinkers on. And even though we do upgrade the early speed rating a bit for that, there was no math formula that was going to upgrade as much as he did. He suddenly started running a lot faster and a lot closer to the pace. So I just look for things like that, things that might have changed with the horse or horses that are just getting better quickly.
One of the other things that I use, Pete, to Craig's point, when kind of self-editing the pace projector, is the post position, the rider, and the distance change. Those are 3 other things that I'll take into account. I think Craig can speak on it better than me, obviously, but I think there is some sort of an adjustment based on the distance change. But I think post position and rider intent are 2 other things that you can use to kind of self-edit the pace projector.
I like those.
Yeah,
ideas.
that's definitely a good point. That's actually something we have in the works, especially with the riders, is using their tendencies and building it into the pace projector. So hopefully we'll see that in the future.
That's a great idea, and I love to hear, Craig, that you guys on the TimeformUS side are continuing to be creative and look to introduce new wrinkles to the product, because I think some of the most exciting stuff for the horse player to come out in the last few years has come courtesy of TimeformUS, and it makes me happy to hear you're not just sitting on your laurels, but continuing to try to innovate. And I love that idea of using riders to try to help inform horse players when it comes to which horses are more likely to try to make the early pace and which ones are maybe more likely to hold on when they set it. And it sounds like that's in the works. Very cool. JK, I haven't given you your say on this year's Brea yet. What are you thinking here?
Well, Craig's argument is compelling about it speeding up quite a bit. And I don't like, and we talked about it on the show today, I don't like the fact that Unique Bella is drawn inside. If she was drawn outside, that would be significantly more advantageous for her, I think. Paradise Woods is starting to look a little bit better and better, cutting back. She doesn't necessarily have to be as forwardly placed as she has been in her 2-turn situation, so she could sit a little bit of a trip. She's got a patient rider in Flavian Pratt, a trainer that can get a horse to relax, and Richard Mandela. And I think the cutback could hit her right in between the eyes. So I think Unique Bella is a special animal, and being a part of that blistering fast pace in a race that fell apart, and the filly that saw a 50, 60 to 1-shot win in Bar of Gold. I think that race suggests that there might be more if she can get a little bit more of a comfortable trip. I just worry that she might not get that. If you nailed me to the wall, it'd be Paradise Woods.
Okay, I like it. This is just another good example of how nicely the two products, TimeformUS and Formulator, can dovetail to be able to be making assumptions based on those numbers and then immediately click. And obviously you can do this in TimeformUS too, but get the more familiar chart view where then you can cycle through. I love all the different chart views in Formulator to be able to go through and look at the buyer figures and what they are, to be able to look at my own notes potentially, to be able to look at the DRF comment, to be able to look at the raw fractions. It's just a lot of information available in a new form, and I think it's something that a lot of horse players are going to be very excited to continue to incorporate into their handicapping, especially this extra view into the pace and into where horses are going to be in these races at the pace call. I think your handicapping can't help but improve when you have a much clearer sense of not only where the horses are going to be at the wire and who you like to win the race, but you can really do what we call race design and see how the races are going to unfold. And to me, there's really no better tool out there than the TimeformUS pace figures for allowing that to happen. Let's move on to the other featured race, the other grade one on the day. This is the Malibu, another race that it feels like when you look at it from a pace figure point of view, pace might end up being one of the reason the whoever wins this race gets the job done. Because again, it doesn't look like, looking at the pace figures, that there's a ton of early speed. Do you agree, Craig, with the pace projector here that this one favors a horse who's going to be on or near the early lead?
Yeah, this is actually the horse I like in here. City of Light drew the rails, surely going to go out of the gate. And this is actually a good example of the red fractions on dirt Jonathon was mentioned earlier. This horse dueled around the track, got ran down late by Dabster, who's also in this field. But just by the red fractions, I think City of Light ran the better race. I think he's going to have an easier trip today. And I also think he's going to be a price. Never been in a stakes race before. Those two are both stepping up out of allowance races. I'm sure Pavel's going to take plenty of money, along with a couple others in here, coming out of some bigger races. So I'm looking forward to betting City of Light in here.
All right, JK, how do you see it?
Well, I got a question for the master here. Craig, we were talking about earlier on the show about kind of self-editing the pace projector. And on the podcast, I was going to share who I wanted to pick, and I looked at the pace projector on TimeformUS, and I noticed that it was marked blue on favors horses near on or near the lead, and then I noticed that the horse I wanted to pick wasn't even in the picture. And so with Pavel, am I missing something that he should or could be more forwardly placed now, cutting back to 7 furlongs, coming out of 1.25 mile races, or do you feel pretty confident that he's going to be towards the rear of the field early in the race?
No, I wouldn't say I'm confident with that. Whenever you have a horse like him who's just, he's been routing, we try not to guess what he can do. We just base it on how fast he has been running. So he doesn't have any sprint races other than his maiden win, which actually was coated in blue and has a slow pace. So I have no issue with anybody saying that, if you tell me, that you're crazy, the pace projector's wrong, Pavel's got a lot more speed. It's certainly possible. He hasn't shown it because he hasn't been given the opportunity. He's certainly shown plenty of talent, and he runs fairly close up in routes. So I seriously doubt he'll be at the back of the field. I'd expect more probably mid-pack, and it wouldn't shock me if he's sitting third or second in this race.
Does that affect your view, Jonathon, of who's going to win here?
No, I don't think it affects my view. I mean, he's definitely the horse that I want in that spot. We talked about it earlier. I'm a little bit against favorable outcome with Chad Brown shipping west in a dirt race. Not that Chad can't get that done, but unfortunately, the butterfly effect, the Chad Brown effect, will be seen at the tote board, and that horse will probably take more money than he deserves. So I'll try to beat favorable outcome in here with a little bit of Pavel. I like CZ Rocket. I'm hoping that CZ Rocket could get a little bit ignored for the same reasons that Craig mentioned about City of Light, this being his first stake appearance. So those are the ones I'm going to look at the most. And then we joked earlier, I had the Donegal Silks find a way to beat me when I don't bet them. So I better probably try to find a way to include Irish Freedom as a saver.
Get a little Irish Freedom in there as well for JK in the Malibu, if only defensively. We've got a few more minutes. The folks who are watching live have the opportunity to submit questions. I've gotten a few good ones, and I'm on the lookout for a few more. We'll probably run here about another 10 minutes or so. First question I wanted to ask is for Craig. Why is it important to have the race figures, in other words, these ones over here under the time for the race, as well as the figures for each individual runner, and how do you use those two bits of information?
To be honest, personally, I look at the race figures mostly. The pace figures of the horses, to my idea, or to my mind, are more of a function of the pace of the race and where the jockey placed the horse, more so than the ability. I'm mostly looking at the race shape and where the horses were positioned. The individual horse figures, the horse pace figures, I mean, I do give them a look, but like I said, I'm more of a pace shape guy. I'm looking for that in-race bias, whether it's red fractions that usually set up for off the pace types or blue fractions that help those up near the lead. So I'm more of a race figure guy, but some people like both, so that's why we have both. We've had them in TimeformUS. I believe that there it's an option. You see one or the other. You don't see both. And in TimeformUS, I always use the race figures. And when I look at Formulator, that's what I gravitate to.
Right. You can always, in TimeformUS, essentially project what the individual horse figures are simply by how many lengths they were off of the race figures. Am I right in that?
Right. Yeah. It's usually pretty simple to figure out. It changes a little bit by distance, the value of a beaten length, but not that much that, it's close enough in my opinion.
Now, we had a question come in about these other symbols that you see in the PP, where you'll see for example, looking at Irish Freedom, there's a C, and there's a C with a circle around it, and there's another C down here. In other situations, you'll see figures that indicate the opposite thing, which I believe, I'm looking for one, you'll see, and here it is with City of Light, an S or a closed over S, and the question is how those relate to the Timeform pace figures, and the answer is they don't. It's really a separate methodology. You can find, if you dig, a whole other webinar from long ago with, I believe, Kenny Peck and our old friend Mike Hogan, where they went through and they explained those figures in detail. But just to give a little bit of an idea on it, those have to do with the running, whether the race was run in a way to suit speed horses, which would be an S, or closers, which would be a C, based on the running style of the different horses. In other words, a race coded with, and it's 4 different degrees. I believe the circles are the more intense one, and then just the letter would be like a second level. So for example, a race with an S in a circle would be a race that on paper projected to have 1 speed horse, and there was 1 speed horse, and then the plain S would be a lower grade of that. The plain C would be a race that projected to have many speeds and had many speeds, and then the C with the circle would be there were supposed to be a lot of speeds, and there were a lot of speeds, like in a more definitive way. Let me ask you, Craig, in your study, obviously, different strokes for different folks, and different people look at these things different ways, and it's not, there's no criticism implied depending on how you answer this question, but is that something that you've ever studied or look at, the idea that it's not just the numbers in the pace that predict whether a race is going to be favorable to front runners or closers, but the amount of horses either contesting the pace or not contesting the pace?
Yeah, I'm sure there's some value in there. It's only so much time in the day for me, so I stick to the numbers. But I mean, I've certainly seen races where, it looks like the pace is slow, but the race had a closer feel to it where the speeds just stopped. And, I think the numbers can't measure everything. We're only measuring at certain points of call. We're not measuring, every 100 or 200 yards where the horses might throw a little extra burst of speed in and sap their rivals. And so I don't have any problem with those numbers. And I think from what I've noticed, oftentimes they match. Like we're looking at City of Light. It says it was intensely favoring closers, I guess is how you said it. And we can see the fractions are all in red.
Yep.
And then just below it, you see the S there. And if you look at the pace figures, they definitely have a shape where, it's slight, but the pace was getting faster as they went on. So that is a kind of race shape you would think the front runners would do okay, where the figures get bigger as you go to the right. So, yeah, I have no doubt that definitely is a beneficial tool. I just don't have a lot of experience using it yet.
For me, I would say the S and the C, that's an indicator for me that it's the pace in that race is worthy of further exploration. And potentially something, as in the case of City of Light, where it underlines what an unfavorable situation that was for City of Light. And now knowing that City of Light's going into a situation where there's an opportunity with a clean break, it could be the controlling speed, does make me all the more interested. We got a question, Craig, about the Timeform pace figures and key races. Have you seen any correlation where the races with the faster fractions early, do they tend to be key races, or is there no correlation between those two concepts? And for those that don't know, key races, aka live races that produce more than two or more next out winners, but really we look at them just as live races, the kind of races you want to bet horses coming out of them.
Yeah, for me, I definitely think when you have red fractions in maiden races or red pace figures, I say fractions, I use them interchangeably. But when you see red fractions in maiden races, those are maiden races I'm interested in the winners coming out of for sure. Especially when they take on first-time starters that are getting bet, those kind of tend to get overlooked. But as far as your day-to-day race, I'm more of I like to dig a little deeper. I'm not a big key race guy once you get outside of maiden races.
Gotcha. Well, that makes sense. Certainly a place where they're very applicable. We had one more for Jonathon. JK, other than what you said before about upgrades and downgrades, are there any other ways you use the TimeformUS pace figures to help in your handicap?
No, I usually do use them for upgrades and downgrades, but I also think that using the pace figures is important when you're trying to try to identify a pace scenario, right? So, Craig said earlier that he usually keeps his setting on TimeformUS for this race, not this horse. Luckily, with Formulator and turning on this setting, you get to see both in the same screen. I use this horse a lot in turf sprints because I want to know who is the speed of the speed. And I think you can tell a better story by identifying who is the speed of the speed in those situations. So that's the other place that I use it is to understand the pace scenario itself, to identify which horse actually is the fastest, and I can see it in a race by race situation rather than the average that is provided in the pace projector. And why that's important is because the different distances that are run in turf sprints is significant. If you run a 144 going 5 furlongs at Gulfstream, and you run a 123 or a 127 going 6 furlongs at Belmont, the horse from South Florida is going to clear, and I want to see that. I want to see that number for that horse itself.
All right, we got a couple of more questions. This is a super easy one for me about how to turn on the pace figures, and it's very simple in Formulator, as I'm demonstrating there. You go to View, and you can just toggle it on and off. You've got the TimeformUS line. For some reason, you're printing or something, and you just want a more bare bone version of the PP, and you don't want to print it. You can take it off, and then you can click right back on here and put it back on. Super simple. We also had a question about late pace ratings, Craig. This is something we've talked about before in our handicapping sessions about the TimeformUS product. Is there any plan to incorporate the equivalent of an LP late pace number separate from the other numbers in the pace array? And if there is not, how do you judge who the best closers are going to be?
Well, I judge it by the late pace rating, but like with everything else, I do use some of my own judgment. If I have a horse coming out of all turf races, suddenly running in a dirt sprint, he's going to have a big number, but that doesn't mean I'm going to bet him. But there are plans to do that, kind of an incremental pace rating thing. That is, I assume, what he's talking about, like you can do with fractions, where you would just see a rating for the late pace. That can actually be calculated, and if you follow me on Twitter, I'll post a link to where I explain that, and it's actually pretty simple, just some basic division and multiplication. But I understand nobody wants to do that, over and over again. So that is something that's in the works. It's on our list of things to do. I'm just not sure when it'll get done. It's up to how it gets prioritized by our bosses and the tech team.
And just to clarify, this late pace number here, again, the 72 for City of Light, that's a composite based on what, the last 5 runs, Craig?
Yeah, it doesn't use them all. If we could do a whole webinar on how it comes up with those, but it uses the best. It's not just one, but I think it's the best 3. But there's a bunch of rules on there where, it'll throw out some if it's going to skew the number too much. It's just kind of an overall. It actually kind of tells you how the horse is going to run most of the time. And they're also meant to be compared over distances. So, for example, this is a 7 furlong race. You're going to notice that most of the horses are going to have much lower late pace ratings. If you have a 1.5 mile turf race, they're going to be a lot slower early pace ratings and a lot higher late pace because, horses change distances and change surfaces all the time. So we want to be able to compare them to each other when they face off. So that gets a little confusing for people when they first see it. They think, well, this horse is a closer in a 6 furlong dirt race, but he only has a 70 late pace rating. It's not meant to be compared to the early it's only meant to be compared to the horses in the same race.
Right. That's a great point. You're not able to look at these ratings up here, this little capsule rating about early and late pace. You can't look at the horses running in the 6th race and the 8th race and make comparisons, right, Craig? You really want to be just looking at the other horses in this race.
Right. They're based on the conditions of the race that they're in. So, yeah, that's the ones we want to stick with. Hey, can I say one other thing, a little bit off topic before you get to another question? I get asked quite a bit about the Beyer speed figures and how they compare. And I think that's a really good tool you have here is that you're actually getting 2 different final time speed figures. And nobody's a bigger fan of Andy Beyer than I am. I mean, I could never pay him back all the stuff I've learned from him, from all his books and all his writing. But, we both, there's figures that are tough to make. And generally, people ask, how do you compare them? And I say, in general, the average is usually if you take 20 points away from mine, you should be within a few points of the Beyer.
Sure.
And the reason I bring that up is, hey, speed figures are tough. There's a lot going on. So when you see a difference between the two, that's a race that you may want to give pause and say, hey, maybe that was a tough race to make figures for, be it Beyer. And like I say, I'm sure I get some wrong. I'm sure Andy would admit that he gets some wrong on occasion. So it's just good to have 2 sets of figures, 2 things to look at are better than one.
I agree completely. It's more an art than a science in many ways. Would you agree with that, Craig?
Yeah, it definitely is. I much prefer when it's a science, which is probably about 90% of the time. But there's definitely a good 10% of the races where, it's just tough. You don't have a lot of information. I don't want to beat up on Gulfstream too much because I do that. Unfortunately, I have to do that for other things. But, for example, the other day they ran turf races on 3 different turf courses, essentially. So, and some of the races are for maidens that have barely run. So you do the best you can with the speed figures. But when you have limited data, there's always going to be some ambiguity with those numbers. So I'd rather, heck, I'm going to look at the Beyer and say, hey, maybe I screwed this one up. Andy has it rated totally different. And give it another look, or at least know that, hey, this was a tough race. I might not want to be betting based on that speed figure.
I like what you said about the 20-point difference. That seems to be a good, quick, and dirty. So, for example, when the difference is about 20, you can kind of know in your head, hey, Andy and Craig have this the same. If the difference is 10 or the difference is 30, there's some disagreement here. Maybe there was more of a challenge in this figure. I want to be. It doesn't mean you're not going to want to bet one figure or the other, but you want to be conscious of the fact that there is disagreement. So maybe that's going to mean you're going to get great value, or maybe that means you're going to go one way or the other and end up a little bit disappointed. But to have that extra bit of knowledge, it's just invaluable. And to be able to have it for the first time ever in one PP, I mean, again, for me, that's just going to take a lot of make work out of the equation. We're just about out of time here, guys. JK, any final thoughts you have about this new incorporation of Timeform pace figures into the Formulator PPs, or any other message for the crew?
No, I love it from a visual standpoint. It should make our friend and podcast contributor at times, Nick Tamero, feel proud, because when I met Nick 3 years ago, he was taking blue marker and circling the running the running line or whatever of the things that were blue or red and Timeform. So essentially, this is done for him now. It's going to give that visual that he's been looking for. So I think it's great that they added it, and I think it's extremely useful, and I think people will enjoy it. Even if it doesn't become a huge part of what you're doing, I think that it's definitely a great supplement.
And I do think it has the potential to really change the way people look at things. Craig, a final thought from you, a response to JK's Durant crack, if nothing else?
Well, first I want to say our IT team did a great job with this. I mean, it looks really good, better than I ever could have imagined.
It looks awesome.
And, as far as the cupcake there, let's just say it's about 20 degrees here today, and I'd rather go check the mail in my boxer shorts and watch him play.
Fantastic stuff. All right, that's all the time we have. I want to thank Craig Milkowski. I want to thank Jonathon Kinchen. Most of all, I want to thank everybody who took the time to watch the show, especially those of you who signed up to participate in the handicapping session live and watched and asked questions. We're going to be having more of these shows down the line. Again, if you like this type of analysis and talking about racing, please feel free to join us on the DRF Players Podcast. Check out of the Gate, a show that we all make regular contributions to as well. I'm Peter Thomas Fornatale, and you've been watching content produced by DRF.com.
Okay, thanks, guys.
Cheers. We'll talk soon.
See you, Pete.